All right, Alexander, let's run through the questions from our live stream that we did yesterday. And we got quite a lot of good questions from ODYSEE, Rumble, YouTube, and locals. So let's jump into it. And let's start off with David S. and his $4 super sticker, and Valley S. Thank you for your super chat. Commander Crossfire says all warfare is based on deception. Thank you very much. And Raphael Lingod said, for the first time, CNN admitted on the air that we do not have any defense against these types of weapons. LA Times is saying the U.S. is okay for Ukraine to compromise. The hypersonic weapons, I imagine.
The first is absolutely true. There is no defense to hypersonic weapons, and the fact that the Russians are using them in Ukraine, I think, is two purposes. Firstly, to test them, to see whether they work, and it seems that they do, and they are very accurate, as it turns out. So this is one thing that they're doing. But secondly, it's a reminder to the West, to people who are talking about no-fly zones and interventions, that if they go down that road, the Russians have lots of tools that they can bring out and deploy, and we have no defense to them. So they've now got these Kinzhal hypersonic weapons, which are the ones that they're using in Ukraine. But perhaps much more concerning for the West is the Zircon hypersonic missile system that entered service with the Russian military last year, and which can be carried on ships, but it now turns out that it can also be used from ground launches. So we have no system that can defend ourselves from these weapons. Obviously, Ukraine can't. But as I said, I think first and foremost, it's a signal to the West.
All right, Commander Crossfire says yields on Russian 10-year benchmark OFZ surged to over 20% at the opening of the Moscow exchange this morning. Ruble gained against the dollar.
Yeah, okay. I mean, can I just say, one shouldn't draw too many conclusions about what happened on Monday, because this is the reopening of the Russian markets. And I think overall, actually, again, I got the impression that the central bank feels that the situation is fairly stable. Obviously, there were some movements up and down. The ruble weakened and then strengthened over the course of the day. But overall, it's quite clear that there is not going to be a major or fundamental crash, and the central bank seems to have everything under control for the moment. I think perhaps an even more interesting development is that it's now absolutely confirmed that JP Morgan has processed Russia's debt repayments, its hard currency debt repayments. There's a much bigger one coming up, I believe, at the end of this month. This is of about $2 billion, but it looks like that's going to be paid too. And I think that we're going to see that Russian debt is just going to continue to be paid, because I think the legal consequences of not doing that are going to be enormous. And I think that the fact that the debt is going to be repaid, and the fact that, as I said, Russia's hard currency earnings are actually rising with the increases in the energy prices, is over time going to have a stabilizing effect on Russian markets too. Just one final piece of information on the economic things, which is that there are a lot of companies, Western companies, have pulled out of Russia. Banks so far have been reluctant to do so. But most interestingly, French companies are apparently not doing so either. They're staying in Russia for the moment, which has been a bit of a surprise, but apparently they've been advised to stay by the French government. I suspect that deep down, some people in France are saying this is a very good opportunity for us to replace the Germans in this market. So do be aware that this kind of thing is going on all the time.
Raphael says 80% of NATO, EU will be forced to resign when everything is settled. Media in the US and Europe will be forced to reform the way they do business. It's crazy.
I wish. I think it's far more likely that as the catastrophe unveils, all of these people will be promoted to ever better and higher things. In the West, the most certain way of getting promoted and rising is to fail, provided you fail in the right way. I mean, just look at what happened after the Iraq War. Every one of the people who advocated the Iraq War is still around. Tony Blair has now become the great oracle of truth in London. They're all still there. They're all rising. All of the people who opposed the Iraq War have been dispersed to the winds. That's certainly the case in Britain. I'm sure it's also the case in the US. And I'm afraid it's going to be exactly the same with this crisis.
From Nitswitch, some newspapers called out the Indians as N word for their caste systems. What kind of ploy could be behind this? Heard this in Deutschlandfunk, propaganda obvious, but why?
Well, indeed, because they're absolutely furious with the Indians for not going along with the West's policies of sanctioning Russia. And by the way, there's been a very interesting incident here because the Prime Minister of Japan, which is a country that has supported the sanctions against Russia, he was sent to India. Remember, Japan and India are part of the Quad, which is this anti-Chinese semi-alliance. So he's an important ally, or so some people in Washington presumably thought, to India, somebody that the Indians would value. So the Prime Minister of Japan went to India, and the rumors are that he offered the Indians $42 billion in Japanese investment if India came out and supported the sanctions. Well, not even supported the sanctions, but condemned Russia over the Ukraine affair. And the Indians didn't exactly send him packing, but they refused. So it looks as if the Indian position is hardening. And from what I understand, it is supported right across the political spectrum in India as well.
All right, Commander Crossfire says, I bought a magic mug. Thank you very much, Commander Crossfire. Uncle Vanya sent us a super sticker, Uncle Vanya, the new name of the McDonald's in Russia now. Toilet Sauce
by the way, can I just say on Uncle Vanya, a brilliant play by Chekhov. And the play in which when he wrote it, he actually said that you have a loaded gun in the first act, it's going to go off at some point in the play by the third. So if you show a loaded gun, it's going to go off. And always remember that with what the neocons are doing. And it's absolutely clear to me that they have China in their sights. And perhaps before very long, India too. There's already been a very difficult conversation between Xi Jinping and Biden. And we're hearing more about sanctions against China coming. We're going to do a program about this. So, Uncle Vanya, interesting to remember that.
Toilet Sauce says, eventually they will buy Russian oil and gas via a middleman, such as Qatar. Don't be surprised if Qatar starts supplying gas to Germany via Nord Stream 2.
It wouldn't be at all surprised. Actually, that's entirely possible. I mean, this is a very good point because, of course, you've got to send liquefied natural gas from Qatar via pipelines, not via ships, all the way to Europe. It's more logical for Qatar, actually, to send its LNG to Asia, and that's been its primary market. So you can't just move things round. If there is ever a deal done, then it's entirely possible that Qatari gas will actually be gas that, you have swaps. So Qatar sends gas to Asia, actual LNG gas to Asia, but it contracts to sell a certain amount of gas to Europe. That gas is actually supplied via the existing Russian pipelines. It's probably Russian gas. The Europeans pay the Qataris, who then pay the Russians the price as a middleman. It all becomes unbelievably complicated, but that's not by any means an impossible scenario if it ever happens. I understand that even if Qatar increases production, doubles production, it still can't come close to matching Russian gas. And of course, LNG is inherently more expensive anyway.
Paul says the MSM continues to lie. They are claiming that Russia is faltering in Ukraine. Gentlemen, why are they so insistent on this delusion?
Well, indeed, and apparently it's having an effect because I understand there's a report circulating, which of course I can't confirm, that the Ukrainian commanders in eastern Ukraine have now asked the government in Kiev permission to withdraw from Donbass. I mean, I got that. I saw that report. I can't confirm it, but I think it's entirely plausible. But of course, what happened was that the authorities in Kiev, the government in Kiev, if it is in Kiev, said no. And one of the reasons is, of course, a withdrawal from Donbass would contradict the propaganda of success. So you get trapped in order to sustain the fictions that you're spreading into decisions that are completely wrong.
Commander Crossfire says Ukraine suspends opposition parties, orders media to create single info control propaganda campaign. Ukraine medic orders mutilation of POWs. The sweet taste of democracy. Not at all like 1930s Germany.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to skip the point about the awful comments about mutilations because I mean that this terrible kind of thing was said. I'm not even going to talk about, but it is indicative of what you said. But the reason I have no doubt why Zelensky ordered let's be straightforward about it, banning of opposition parties and is seeking to centralize media control is I think that the entire Ukrainian leadership has been spooked by the disappearance of Viktor Medvedchuk. I'm going to guess that it was the Russians who sprung him. I mean, it seems logical. Sprung him from house arrest. There's no information as to his whereabouts. I think they're terrified that now that he's out and about in Ukraine or wherever he is, he's going to use the undoubted contacts that he has within the Ukrainian political system in order to try to set up some kind of an alternative power structure. And so they've taken this preemptive step of banning all these parties.
Jose Alvarado says, recovering MSM news junkie here. New to this channel, so far so good. Well, welcome, Jose, to this channel. Chris, thank you for your super chat. Bruno, thank you for your super sticker. Radovid says, the art of war, the highest form of attack is attack on strategy, to win the war without a battle. Next is attack on armies. The lowest is attack on fortified cities.
Yeah.
Well said.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wish people read that. Actually, I mean, neither of us, neither Alex nor I, are soldiers or have military backgrounds. And by the way, we are working with somebody who has an stellar military background. We're thinking we'll be able to have him on our programs. But both of us can read, and we can read Sun Tzu, and we can read Clausewitz, and it's all there. What the Russians are doing, I'm going to just make an observation. What the Russians are doing in Ukraine is real war. What we have tended to do in the West, and I don't want to generalize too far, is we have fought virtual wars. We've sent, aircraft bombing, flying around, bombing for months. We don't always know exactly what they're attacking. Then eventually the forces that we are attacking, they retreat, or some kind of compromise is made, and we claim victory. But that doesn't actually achieve, in the end, a real victory. We saw that in Iraq, we saw that in Afghanistan, we saw that in Libya. This war that is being fought in Ukraine, is going to end in an actual victory, because it is a real war.
Too Small says, keep us informed. Video of Xi talk. We'll do a video on China.
We're going to do it, absolutely, yeah.
Well. So you'll see that up. Let's see. Euro Gabor says, up to 40,000 Libyan mercenaries ready to join the 16,000 Syrian volunteers to support the Russian military campaign, with the Chechens on the ground already. Zelensky urgently needs a boarding pass. He may have already had that boarding pass.
Yeah. I'm hearing reports, which of course I can't confirm, that the Russians are absolutely flooded by people, by requests from people in Africa and the Middle East who want to join this war. As a way, basically, of sticking it to the US and to the EU. That's what it's really about. So I hope we don't see tens of thousands of people. I think that would be terrible, actually. I don't think we want to escalate it, but anyway, that's the position at the moment.
Well, Russia doesn't need it, so I mean,
No, doesn't Russia need it? Doesn't need it. Exactly.
So,
No.
Quick Man Sam says Ukraine and Taiwan are as much red lines for U.S. as they are for Russia. And China is, if the U.S. loses dominion over them, it would spell the end of U.S. hegemony.
Well, in terms of Ukraine, it clearly isn't as much of a red line for the US as it is for Russia, because Russia has boots on the ground in Ukraine and they are fighting there. And the US so far is not, despite all the claims and demands and rhetoric from all sorts of people that, the US does engage the Russians in Ukraine. Now, I will say this, if the Russians win in Ukraine, which I am sure they will, then of course that might increase pressure within the US to take a harder line with China on Taiwan. And of course, for China, Taiwan is the brightest of red lines.
Ihang 101 says another possible false flag, reports of Russian jet entering Polish airspace confirmed by Ukrainian and Polish radar.
Well, I mean,
I can't confirm it. So
I can't confirm it one way or the other. I mean,
okay. Thank you for that super chat. Sparky says complete destruction, carpetbagging opportunities is equal to carpetbagging opportunities.
Oh, absolutely, of course.
Yes,
The two go hand in hand.
Thank you, Sparky, for that. Ryan Addy says, greetings from Tampa, Florida. Radian says, thanks for being a great alternative to the global elite propaganda media. Keep up the good work, gents. Thank you for that. Eugene says, Gonzalo, I think you're being a little hard on the U.S. military. If the Russians had our resources, they'd probably apply overwhelming firepower too.
I don't think so. I think I would say something about the U.S. military. I think that soldiers, the officers, the people who run the military are outstanding. And I think they have some amazingly good weapons. I'm not a critic of the US military at all. I think the politicians who run wars in the US, the neocons, if you like, people like Rumsfeld, Cheney, whoever is in charge now, they don't understand war. And they require the US military to fight its wars in a certain way because they don't want casualties, which might undermine political support for the wars in the US. And at the same time, they don't really care tiddly squat about the countries that they are fighting in. So I think, one mustn't criticize the military in the US. The military, if it was doing its job, I think would do it completely differently. I don't think they would want to get involved in places like Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya. I don't think you're comparing like with like exactly. I think in Russia, the military is much more closely integrated in the political leadership. This is something, by the way, which we don't fully understand either in the West. In the West, we have a very clear division between civilians and military. In Russia, it isn't quite like that, so that someone like Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, sits as an ex officio member of Russia's Security Council, which, despite its name, is actually its top policy-making body, policy-making even on domestic policies. So it's a more integrated leadership than the one we have in the West, than the one we know and have in the United States.
John Edwards says, is the denazification really the de-Westernization of Ukraine?
What a very interesting and clever question. I think ultimately, yes.
Rhett Butler says, do you think the Ukrainian refugees will ever return to Ukraine, or has there been a voluntary ethnic cleanse?
I think if
I wouldn't use the word ethnic cleanse.
No, I wouldn't.
On that.
I wouldn't.
But
no, I wouldn't. I don't like.
I
loathe that word.
Return.
Yeah,
I think a large amount will return.
Yes, certainly the ones who've gone to Russia will eventually return, I think.
And the ones in Greece and the ones that I see here, I don't think they're planning on staying. I mean,
no.
They're here, but I think it's clear that they're not going to stay. I mean, maybe the ones in Poland. I think Poland may have a problem.
Maybe. Yes, and it may also be. It's also a question of where they come from and how the war evolves. And I mean, if the Russians do go to Western Ukraine, which I still don't think they will, difference opinion about this within our community. But if they do, and people from Western Ukraine leave, and if the Russians do eventually take over Western Ukraine and it becomes absorbed in whatever new political entity is created, it may be that people from there will decide not to return. But in general, I agree with Alex. I think most of them will go back.
Yeah. We'll see if Poland makes a move on West Ukraine. There's some rumblings saying that Biden's visit to Warsaw may mean that Poland's going to actually make a move on the West and open up another front, which would be interesting. Anyway, summer of 1970, Vlad versus Jomencha. My bet is on Vlad. Thank you very much for that super chat. Sanjiva says, Lord, pray you protect Gonzalo from all strife. Gonzalo, what proportion of Ukrainians actually like the Russians? Graham Phillips, Donbass supporter, in his video showed almost all Ukrainians in Horodnya against Russia. Story in Ukraine as a whole.
I don't think this is true, but I mean, I'm not able to give. I don't see any opinion polls about this. About in the autumn, there was an opinion poll in Ukraine that said about 40% of Ukrainians agreed with Putin that Ukrainians and Russians were one nation, which I thought was an interestingly high figure. But I mean, I'm not going to give a guess. What I will simply say is this: there's been some scattered protests in parts of what you might call Russian-occupied Kherson province by Ukrainians, but nothing that remotely approximates or comes up to being major opposition. So I'm going to give a pass on that one. What Gonzalo thinks about it, we might ask him when we next speak to him.
Tim says, has anyone heard Marine Le Pen's opinion?
I haven't actually, not very much. I mean, she's been pushed out back. And what I'm hearing, by the way, is that the person who's making the biggest inroads now in the French presidential election is the leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Now, that may be a bit out of date. I mean, that was about a week ago that I saw that, but that he's currently surging. And I think what's causing him to surge is that he's coming out strongly against NATO and is all but supporting the Russians in this conflict. That might reflect opinion in France. I mean, I don't know. But I have to say, I think Le Pen completely mismanaged her election. And I'm afraid I think the likelihood is, not the likelihood, the very high probability now is that Macron will be re-elected.
Sparky says, didn't Hillary pass hypersonic tech to Russia?
Probably. I'm not saying. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. I mean, we mustn't. This is, I think, a big mistake people make, is that they imagine that Russians and Chinese and others are technologically backward people. They're not technologically backward people. The United States, historically, is a much richer country, and therefore it has more resources. So it can use those resources to develop particular technologies much faster than others do. But that doesn't mean that the others can't develop their own technologies if they put their mind to it, and that they can't also take leads over the US in particular technological segments. I think if Hillary did sell hypersonic technology to the Russians, we would be seeing more hypersonic weapons coming out of the US than we're seeing at the moment.
AD says, is the Russian central bank going to have to nationalize and control of IMF over it abolished? One has to doubt that cause. Nabulina still there.
I don't know. My own personal view about Nabulina, I know that there is a huge amount of hostility to her from what you might call the anti-globalist people. I think that they assume that Nabulina herself is a globalist. And I think, a bit like Putin, she's gone through various stages in her career. But at the moment, and I have to say this, and I've been a major critic of Nabulina in the past. I thought that her interest rate policy after 2015 was wrong. I thought that it drained the economy out of liquidity at a time when it needed more liquidity in order to grow faster. But anyway, at the moment, it seems to me that she's doing all the right things. And I personally have to say that, and I suspect that, she's come on a voyage of discovery. And the fact that she's stayed in the central bank suggests to me that she was obviously consulted about this operation in Ukraine in advance and supports it. So that's all I'm going to say about Navalny. I know that many people in the West have, in the financial world, the anti-Russian financial world, have been deeply upset by the fact that she's chosen to stay at the helm of the central bank. They expected her to resign, and I read 2 articles in the British media which actually said that she had resigned. So, I mean, it's something just to, bear in mind. They said that she'd resigned on the very day that she was reappointed.
Radovich says, the art of war, always give to the enemy a way to escape. To your soldiers, never. So they will fight without hesitation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Radovich. Kathy, thank you for that amazing super sticker. Kathy Henson, thank you very much for that. Ventus Bruma says, speaking of the election in the fall, the GOP has started doing voter registration drives outside of gas stations. Yes, they have. Very true. Thank you very much for that, Ventus. And RD Doctor says, does world systems theory and imperialism explain how we cause conflicts on the periphery of Europe?
Yes. I think we're going to have to revisit a lot of that literature that dates from the early 20th century, which is actually, some of which is actually very good. And because clearly there is I know it's vehemently denied, but there is a subtext of imperialism, or what was once called imperialism, in a lot of this geopolitical conflict. And I don't want to give the impression it's only all from one side, just the US. I mean, some of what the Chinese, some of what the Russians do, has some of those elements about it as well. And if you watch one of the debates in the Security Council, you could see that some of the African delegates were particularly worried that, in the conditions of new Cold War, a lot of this would, become stronger again, just as it did during the Cold War itself.
The world we created says, may the force be with you. Thank you very much for that super chat. Gordon, thank you for your super sticker. The Imp, thank you for that amazing super chat. The Imp, thank you very much. Arthur says, from the New York Times, one of the leads is Wall Street and/or Fed banks as they are fearing a full crash and the end of dollars if Russia goes in default.
Exactly, which is why at the moment they're paying its debt. They're allowing Russia to pay its debts. So it's not absolutely certain that they will continue to do this. We will know after the end of May. But I studied the documents, the US documents at the time the sanctions on the central bank were imposed with great care. And it was absolutely clear to me that the Americans who held debt were allowed to unwind their Russian debt, were allowed to unwind it. In other words, find sellers for it. It was assumed that the Russians would not be able to go on paying their debt right from the first moment. And the fact that they are being allowed to do so at the moment suggests to me that they will continue to be allowed to do so beyond May, and there is provision in the sanctions decision to permit that. In which case, I have to say, the whole exercise of sanctioning the central bank would prove to be a disastrous bluff, which had been called. All it will have done will have been to signal the fact that there are structural weaknesses in the financial system in the West. And of course, it will also have accelerated the end of globalization by encouraging a G20 economy, Russia, through its central bank, to impose capital controls.
Jan Ledoux says the U.S. cannot accept the New World Order. That would be the consequence of Putin succeeding. Thus, they have to intervene. World War III is thus inescapable. No?
I hope not. I mean, I understand the logic. I hope not, though. I still think in the end they will do lots of things, but they will draw back. I mean, look at what they've just done in the sense that, just yesterday, I was hearing reports about the fact that the US is going to supply antiquated anti-aircraft missile systems, Soviet anti-aircraft systems,
SAS-8.
Some of them. Yes, some of them from the 1960s to Ukraine. I mean, that's not even tokenism. I mean, it's tokenism that is practically insulting. I mean, I understand that some of these systems, some of the very old ones, have vacuum tubes. I mean,
Sparky says, too many smugnerant narcissists running the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well said, Sparky. Well said. Heyman says, modern day parliaments function almost identically to ancient court culture in China. The interests of a few eunuchs and their personal projects took down more dynasties than any invader ever had. Excellent.
You are obviously somebody who knows your Chinese history very well, because you're absolutely right. Absolutely. If you want, by the way, to get a good account of the fall of a dynasty, read the first chapters of the Chinese novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is about the collapse of the Han Dynasty. And it describes exactly the scenario with eunuchs and courts and all that you just discussed.
HSM Epic Return says, divorce, yes, but it is not a clean territorial line. What about Odessa, most Russian city in Ukraine and the most Jewish Russian city in the world? Ukraine is layers upon layers of overlay.
I agree with that. I mean, this is going to be very messy and very complicated, and we'll see how it works out. What I will say is this. There's one region, Western Ukraine, which I think is relatively coherent and has a particular identity, which is a very strongly anti-Russian identity.
Not all of Western.
Not all of Western Ukraine. I know there's the Russian
Hungarian, Romanian.
Yeah, group exactly. But anyway, we'll see how it. Anyway, we'll see how. But it is a mess. You're quite right. Actually, it's a good point, actually, Alex. Well, we'll see how it works out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I heard rumblings that Transcarpathian Rus.
Yeah.
I think I read the article that they're now starting to say that they want out.
They identify with Russia, apparently.
Yeah,
that's why they're called Rus.
Yeah, and we can't forget that I think the Azov guys or the Nazis were also going after Romanian gypsies in the West as well.
Yeah,
I may be getting that a little wrong, but there are reports of that as well. I mean, it's ugly. It
is very ugly. A mess. Yeah.
Mona L says, Zelensky said the U.S. told him to say he will join NATO, but Ukraine will never be part of it. Why would he openly say that?
Well, he is extremely angry and very bitter. And he says lots of different things at different times, depending on who his script writers is and depending on what he's taken on any particular day, if I may say. But what he actually said, and it was very instructive, was that he was told, he asked repeatedly the US and the NATO Secretariat, look, tell us either that we're joining Ukraine, you're joining NATO or not. And what they were told is that, yes, we will continue to say you will join NATO publicly, but in private you will never join. Now, if Zelensky is telling the truth, and so far no one has contradicted him, then all I will say is that was totally immoral. And I mean, immoral doesn't even measure up to it. And it is exactly what has caused the conflict in Ukraine, which we're now seeing.
I think it shows without a shadow of a doubt that they wanted this war. That's the only reason that I can conclude.
I agree with. I entirely agree with that. I entirely agree with that. Yeah. It also, by the way, suggests.
Just admit it. Yeah.
Exactly. It also strongly suggests, at least to me, that Ukraine is going to be left to itself in the end.
Yep. Rob said, Zelensky, the unlikely billionaire. For how long do you think?
I think he'll be all right. I think they'll find a way of getting him to Washington, to the US. Maybe. Well, we'll see. In which case, as I said, he'll have his beach house in Miami and his residence in his Manhattan residence and all those things. That's my own guess. But, I wouldn't, one can't be certain. And I'd say he's got something else to worry about with some of the people who are, who are close to him, who are probably watching him very closely. And I'm talking about Ukrainians now, and who don't fully trust him either.
Yeah. Imre says, I don't know if it's been mentioned, I'm 80 minutes late. Russia says they used hypersonic Kh-47M2 Kinjal, again, on a fuel depot near Nikolaev. Good day.
Yeah, it's the second time they've done it. Yes, it has been mentioned, and it's an important thing. And as we discussed earlier on the program, it's partly testing this weapon, seeing whether it works, which it quite clearly does. But secondly, it's also a warning to the West, because it's a weapon system that the West has no counter to.
Peace, thank you for that. Super sticker. Sparky says, maybe it's feared that Kamala isn't controllable.
Yeah, could
she
very well be.
Make some strange statements. That's for sure. She's not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
To say that. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah. Toilet Sauce says 100 years from now, people will be talking about the European Peninsula and not the European continent.
So good. I love it. Yeah, that was a very, very good point, actually.
Thank you very much, Toilet Sauce, for that. Peace, Jen. Thank you for that super chat. Rolf says, I think any president cannot be singularly praised or blamed for what happens during his term. Who knows what potential deep state elements are responsible for what is attributed to Biden? Thanks.
Absolutely true. Completely right. I entirely agree with that.
Gilbert says, astute point on Trump. Brilliant show as ever, guys. Thank you very much for that. Gilbert. Jean-Eric, thank you for that super chat. Hey Man says, Western culture dominance is overwhelming. Hordes of educated Russians, Chinese, and Indians have fallen in love with approval from liberal false idols.
Well, a lot of them have done, but don't over-exaggerate. You're talking about Chinese. The proportion of Chinese people who seem to be drawn to that is actually relatively small, percentage-wise. In Russia, it's more. But my own experience in Russia is that it's very, very much concentrated in certain, not so much demographics, but in certain social groups. Some types of academics, for example, in universities. Humanities academics, for example, seem to be very close to that. Some people in journalism. But I think mostly, both in China and in Russia, the majority of people tend to be fairly patriotic. I remember that I once attended an event with students at a provincial university far away from Moscow, and I was really surprised at how very patriotic they were.
Julie, thank you for that super sticker. And Sparky says the bright side is that Russia-China-India relations have never been better.
Well, I wouldn't say never been better, but they've certainly this has shown the solidity of the Chinese-Russian relationship, and it seems that India is making a conscious choice now to improve its relations with China. And there's been apparently quite significant talks to try and sort out something on the border issue.
Cecil Sid says, I hope Erdogan does sell the S-400s to Ukraine because his relationship with Russia will be finished. He won't. Actually, I think we have confirmation that he won't.
I think he won't. Of course not.
Yeah, I think that's confirmed actually as well. I'm not sure, but I think I read somewhere that he's not doing that. Susie Q19 says someone needs to put the brakes on this soon, otherwise U.S. pride will kick it up to not let Russia get a win.
I'm afraid that that is a very, very good point, but I'm also worried about something else, which is that if things start to go badly wrong in Ukraine, the caravan of intervention will move elsewhere. And maybe Taiwan might be the next point. So, we are on a runaway train, and I don't know where this is going to stop or how it stops.
Pierce says, don't forget the U.S. tried to stage a coup in Ukraine in Turkey not long ago.
I know, well, absolutely. I mean, all kinds of things. They're now trying things. I've heard.
Would you say they staged it or they supported it?
They quietly supported it, and I understand that they're trying to change the government in Pakistan at the moment. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from Pakistani people, that there's a vote of no confidence in Imran Khan, who is the prime minister there. I mean, they will be doing all these sort of things, but in various places. But the big bloc, the key bloc, China, Russia, looks completely solid. And of course, India also, as I said, there doesn't seem to be any argument there amongst the political class about the fact that, they don't support the US on this one.
Pathetic Albion says, what gives me chills, this plane crash. It's too much of a coincidence for my liking.
I think
thought
it's
about that
most
as well.
probably a coincidence, to be honest. I think you mean the Chinese one. I think
Yeah,
it's most probably a
yeah, I think
coincidence.
135
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
Leafy Bug says the Turks already chose the S-400 over the F-35. Why would they go back on this?
Completely true. Completely true.
Yep. Let's see here. I would be surprised if the S-400 does not have a device which can be destroyed by Russia at a switch of a button.
I'm sure that's also true. I'm not a technical man. Don't ask me to discuss those things. But I'm absolutely sure that when the Russians sold the S-400 to Turkey, they will have been extremely careful to make sure that it could not be used against them.
Amy Winston says, many years ago, people complained about Qatar and human rights. Now it's all forgotten.
Of course, exactly, yes. Well, what about Saudi Arabia? I mean, the Saudis have just executed 81 people over the course of a single day. And at about the same time, Boris Johnson was in Riyadh trying to get the Saudis to sell him more oil, which they refused to do, by the way.
Cecil Sid said the Greeks made the most idiotic and incompressible decision to transfer weapons to Ukraine, burned their bridges with Russia, destroyed centuries of soft spots for each other, but it is the politicians, not the people, to blame.
Absolutely. I think that's... Well, I mean, I don't know that this is forever, but the government in Greece takes a very, very rigid Atlanticist, Euro-Atlanticist position. And, you know, one shouldn't expect otherwise. The political class in Greece is Euro-Atlanticist to the core. And that's not going to change.
Leafy Bug says you can get LNG supplied on long-term contracts, not just short-term.
Well, you can get everything supplied on long-term contracts. The question is, why would Qatar agree to do that? I mean, that's not the way they've worked up to now, and I'm sure they won't, because a country like Qatar will want flexibility. It's not like Russia with its pipeline gas. You build the pipeline; it's a huge operation. You then have to sell that gas in a way that it gives you a stable cash flow so that you can recoup the money from that you put into the pipeline. It's a different structure to the industry. Whereas with Qatar, it's much more like oil. It's much more like oil trading. And I think that is what the Qataris will do. If you actually look at what the Qataris said in response to Habeck, the German economics minister, it's absolutely clear that that's what they're thinking of. They're saying, oh yeah, of course, if you want to buy our gas, you're more than welcome. And, you know, it's a commercial deal, but, you know, you have to work it out we can discuss it with your companies. The point is, Habeck did not come with any signed and sealed agreement from the Qataris. That he was just inventing about this. And he doesn't know, as I said, how the energy market works.
Yeah. Danish says a total European embargo on Russia. Are they crazy?
Well,
they're pushing for it.
They're pushing. Some people are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people
the Baltic states are pushing really hard for it.
Absolutely. I mean, and of course, if you're talking about the Baltic states, I mean, they're the ones who will suffer the most from it. But of course, the people who advocate it, who call for it, will not be the ones who will suffer. I've actually read some people in the Baltic states say that they should be subsidized in the same kind of way that West Berlin was. That they're the new West Berlin.
Great. The new West Berlin. Grape says, how come Russia does not bomb the bridges on the Ukraine side of the Polish border to stop weapons coming into Ukraine?
I'm not going to discuss Russian tactics and Russian strategies. Maybe it's because it's too close to the border. I mean, I don't know.
Tsunami Bomb says, what do you think the Ukraine will end up as after this war is concluded?
Well, I think it will lose Donbass. I think Donetsk, Lugansk are gone. I think that some kind of political structures will be created by the Russians in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, which will be aligned with Russia, and they might be in a confederal structure of some kind with the central regions around Kiev. And that's all I get to guess because, as was discussed earlier in this program, this is such a complex place that it's very difficult to say with any certainty what the ultimate picture is going to look like. I'm not sure even the Russians know.
Danish says, not only does the FT watch the Duran, but the Foreign Ministry does too, I believe.
I'm sure they do.
While username says, 3 years from now, we are back to coal. True. And Leafy Bug says, I suspect the Europeans will become very pragmatic very quickly once the consequences of quitting Russian gas start to hit home.
I think that is possible, but what they may very well find is that trust levels have so completely collapsed now that even if the Europeans were to change their position, I'm not sure they will, by the way. I mean, I can't really imagine Ursula and Michel changing their positions, or other countries. But I think even if, for example, there was a political crisis in Germany, which is possible, and the current government in Germany were to fall, which is also possible, and we were to get a new chancellor there, say Friedrich Merz, who seems a much more pragmatic figure, and even if Friedrich Merz was then to go to Moscow and say, look, all this is a disaster, and nothing to do with me, I would like to try and resume these economic links, some of them at least, which have been broken down. I think the Russians would say quietly yes, and I think they would nonetheless still go ahead and quietly drop the contracts for gas and things like that as the as they gradually run out and redirect their market, their economy eastwards. I think the Russians have seen what has happened in Europe over the last few weeks, and I think they've decided that this is a hopeless affair, that they can never really have a stable economic relationship with Europe. It's dangerous for them to try. It leads them into all kinds of problems. And I think that they've decided that a much more stable future for Russia economically is to look east.
JHW says, Gonzalo, how far are the Russian forces from you? We will.
I think he told us 9. I think he said 9 kilometers from the center of Kharkiv, and that he's just beyond the center of Kharkiv, but on the other side. So that gives us, I think, some idea.
Mm-hmm. And Viking Land says, hope the Russians can soon come to Gonzalo's rescue. Bronchia says, in view of the demonstrable socioeconomic self-harming being committed by the political class of the West, don't we need to take a leaf out of Zelensky's book and ban all current political parties? Interesting.
Don't float at ideas like that too much. Somebody might be listening to you.
Scarecrow says, at the Duran, having grown up in Australia, you get brainwashed by the MSM that US good, Russia bad. Now that I live in Southeast Asia, my view on things have flipped, especially regarding the US. Their corruption knows no limitations. All for natural resources and power. The info you guys provide has been invaluable to me understanding the world a little better. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
For that,
Scarecrow. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Y username says, how many here are thinking of moving to Russia, Asia, India, or Africa? Could be fun to have a poll of that. It's a new world that's forming.
A new one. Yeah.
Let's see here. Actually, the first hypersonic strike, they were following a Ukraine armored car convoy going into a covered area and fired into the forest with precision. It's on the Duran. Very impressive.
Interesting. Okay.
Thank you for that.
I gather. Just to quickly say that it was launched from within Russian territory. I think Crimea, actually. So the distance this thing travelled was enormous, and it covered it in 10 minutes.
JHW says...
Yeah. Well, can I just quickly say about that? The fact that they're able to hit something so fast from such enormous distances means that, if you watch it by satellite, you can launch your missile and you can reach it before the target has had time to move. So that's one effect that hypersonic missiles gives you. If you launch a subsonic thing, it might take 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever, by which time, of course, it might have moved away.
JJHW says the Russians have good equipment. The soldiers have their Ratnik kit, which is much better than the old Soviet kit, for example.
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely true, yeah.
K9 Disc says, anyone else think that false flag is going to be a rail attack on NATO diplomats scheduled to come in?
Well, I'm not going to speculate.
If they are in Kiev. If
they are in Kiev, yeah. I'm not going to speculate about what a false flag might look like. I'm worried. All I can say is I'm worried about it.
Yeah, Danish says the immorality of sending your fighters to death for a hopeless cause should be a war crime. Liz Truss, I mean you.
I agree. I completely agree. I completely agree with that.
About that.
Yeah.
A lot of people are upset about that in the UK. I'm seeing a lot of stories about that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let me see here. Real Lot No Sense says, West erodes the will of potential resistance the longer it takes Russia to win the conventional phase. Ukrainian people will get worn out before starting a resistance. These are not Yemeni or jungle fighters used with a life of hardship unimaginable for Europeans.
There's actually some truth. There's actually a good point here. And it's one that's been made to me, which is that, if you win very fast, if you rush into the enemy's capital, capture its, or kill its president, or do those sort of things, but you leave the armed forces of the country still in existence, the men are able to disperse, they take their weapons with them, then that is the way to create the conditions for an insurgency. If you destroy the army, and you destroy its ability to fight, the enemy's ability to fight, then of course you can scoop up the capital and arrest the president, and the potential for an armed resistance becomes much less. And that's been pointed out to me by many people, actually.
John Michael Siddall says the self-inflicted economic devastation that the U.S. and Europe are subjecting their own people to isn't as simply explained as stupidity or arrogance. It's deliberate. It's how you force your population into the globalist agenda toward total dependency upon a singular totalitarian elitist entity.
I understand the point completely, and I personally think it is incompetence, but I'm not saying that I'm right about this. I just don't know ultimately what goes on. It's just that I look at people like Michelle and Ursula and Liz Truss and God help us Biden, and I say to myself, do they really have these deeply laid plans? But I've never known in my lifetime a situation where governments deliberately create hardships for their own people in this kind of way. And that's what Western governments are doing.
K9 Disc says the Gagauz people are there in Transnistria. The Prince of Rus is looking to hook up with the people of the Gog. Can't wait to hear Alex talk about the Greek community up there.
Well, indeed, with the Greek community, there's a lot to say about in Ukraine. It's large and active. And I had a very interesting email, by the way, from my brother about this, and which basically was very close to some of the points that would be made, in our actual live stream about the Greeks in Mariupol and the difficulty the media is having in Greece, trying to silence or trying to counter these information that's coming out. I can't speak for these other communities in Ukraine.
They're failing. People in Greece are starting to talk about it.
Yeah.
Nick RH21, how do you see this conflict in the U.S. and the West's reactions impacting East Asia, specifically Japan, South Korea, and the wider ASPAC area, for example, Vietnam?
Right, I think Vietnam made its choice in the summer, and I think they hardened it after Kamala Harris made an absolutely disastrous trip there. They decided that they're not going to become part of any American strategy against China, which is in a kind of way a de facto partnership with China. So I think Vietnam has made its choice. I think the ASEAN countries overall also will say, look, we're not going to become part of a new Cold War. We're going to trade with China. We're going to trade with the US. We're going to remain balanced. And I think that, again, in a way that leans more towards the Chinese-Russian camp than not, because It's the Chinese Russians who are saying, if you are okay with us, we're okay with you. We're not asking you to take sides. It's the US that's asking people to take sides. It's the US who says, if you're not with us, you're against us. So that's the ASEAN thing. With Japan and South Korea, I understand that Japan has gone along with the sanctions policies quite, readily. I mean, they've not come under a great deal of pressure. South Korea is very unhappy about it.
Carol says, Russia making a bid for freedom from the West, and who can blame them? The West has lost a good opportunity by sidelining Russia. Russia has much of what the West needs, own goal from the West.
You are so right about this. You are so absolutely right about this. Look, go back to the early 1990s when the USSR broke up. There was that real opportunity, and it continued in the first, decade of Putin's rule, for the West to really forge a really close, good, friendly relationship with Russia, and it's been thrown away.
Yeah, Danish says that Gonzalo's right. Russians will never forgive the West for the next 2 generations, 50 years.
I agree. I completely agree. 50 years is a long time, but certainly for the foreseeable future.
Mike Auber 43 says, Alex, can you comment on the statements of the Greek consul in Mariupol?
Well, he has followed
sure statements.
Yes, well, I've seen some of them. Yeah, I mean, he's compared what's going on in Mariupol to Guernica and all that kind of thing. I mean, he's basically taken
said it was a war crime, correct?
War crime, essentially, yes. I mean, I think he actually avoided those particular words, but he's following the line of the foreign ministry in Athens, which is the Mitsotakis line, the government's line, and it's completely predictable. But Greeks who live in Mariupol are taking a different line. The Russians are keeping an eye on all of this, and again, they won't forget it.
Yeah. The Greeks that are here as refugees are speaking out, and it's going viral. Are we talking about Kamala as president? Maybe.
It's a horrible thought, awful thought. But possibly. Is it really worse? Is it really worse than what we have now? Perhaps it is. I mean, I'm not going to say, but I mean, it is really terrible. By the way, on this subject, there was an article in the Telegraph about Nancy Pelosi, which also said, that she is absolutely. I mean, the word he used about Pelosi was that she's weird. I mean, so below the surface, there's enormous disquiet in London about the state of US leadership at the moment.
I could see them dragging Kamala for 2 years.
I could see it too.
They did it for Biden for 2 years.
I could see it. I could see it too.
And it would mean full control of Obama would have full control of things. I would guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, Otto M says Hunter won't serve a day in prison.
Very likely. We'll see. It depends. It depends what they.
If he's indicted, he's indicted by Biden's. Go ahead.
No, go on. I mean, indicted by Biden's Justice Department. That's how.
Yeah, that's what it means, right? An indictment of Hunter Biden is Biden's Justice Department indicting him, correct?
Yes, correct.
So what does that tell you? That Biden's DOJ is going to go after his son?
Well, it tells me one of two things. Either they're going to protect him in some form and the indictment won't be a very significant one and they're going to try to massage this away, or it suggests that it's not actually Biden's Justice Department and that this is all part of some enormous power play within the Democratic Party and the political establishment. So, I don't know which it is at the moment. We've discussed this earlier. We'll just have to see how it works out. Yeah, I don't see, by the way,
goes after his son.
Yes, yeah. I don't see how he can remain president. By the way, I mean, I really don't.
Which means that the DOJ wants him out.
Yeah, I mean, depends, of course, what the charges are. I mean, if it's something minor, but if it's some of the really big things that are on this laptop, then I have real difficulty understanding how the President of the United States can remain President of the United States when the Justice Department is directly accountable to him, and the Justice Department is bringing that kind of case against the President's own son, when the President's son has information stored on his laptop that implicates his father. I mean, I just don't understand how it can happen. I mean, you know, one hears stories about Chinese walls that, you know, the president is going to be kept informed about the prosecution into his son. But I mean, the thing just doesn't really bear thinking about. And I think that's something that perhaps people ought to bear in mind. So I don't know how this is going to shape out. Bear in mind, he hasn't been indicted yet. So, you know, we might be making assumptions, but logically, I just can't see how he can hold on.
Trisha X says, assuming Zelensky is in Poland, then he is probably in the clutches of U.S. security and protected from the NAZI thugs who would kill him if he actually negotiated with Russia. Zelensky will become the new Juan Guaido.
Well, quite likely, but of course that makes the big assumption that he is in Poland. Now, there's lots of reports to this effect, but of course I don't know that those reports are true.
Wade Hampton says, I know the Duran and Barnes Law tend to think Biden will be impeached. He won't. 3 reasons. First, Kamala. Second, the Republican Party's controlled opposition. And third, and most importantly, American politicians are not statesmen, but rather actors hired to do the bidding of their contributors, which are the global ruling class and the American defense contractors. As such, a brain-dead clown like Biden is an ideal president.
I understand that point and that argument entirely. I'm going to make one observation about it. Yes, I think the rhinos, to give them, because it has to be, you know, the rhinos, I think, would not want to impeach Biden. Or at least, I mean, I'm not talking for all of them, but I mean, I think that they would not want to go down that particular route. The problem they have is, I think if they don't, if the Republicans win big in November and they don't press ahead with impeachment, I think there will be a lot of trouble with the Republican base, to put it mildly.
Jenna D says the crisis in Europe is to cut gas in Europe in 2. The South gas pipeline, and its pipeline is Turkey, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Hungary. And then, the North.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be... one way or another, this is a mess. I mean, again, they clearly haven't thought it through, and we're just going to have to see how it works. At the moment, by the way, the response of the Europeans to this crisis is to step up gas purchases from Russia. They're running at record levels.
John Michael said, impeachment means nothing in the United States. No Senate will ever charge and convict any of them. They are all crooks. The U.S. government is saturated with corruption from small-town Main Street to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
It's a very well-informed and very proper comment. I'm afraid the cynicism is eminently justified, but we do live in extraordinary times, and we can't be sure how things will play out, especially in a country like the United States, which is unpredictable in its political dimensions. Mm-hmm.
Military-industrial complex is from Steve, and Pentagon do not want an actual war. They are into money, not fighting.
I agree. I agree. That's one other reason why I think ultimately they're going to draw back and not engage in a war. The business of supplying Ukraine with 1960s Soviet gear, which is completely obsolete, I think is almost a signal from the Pentagon that they just do not want to go there. And they've apparently even ruled out the S-300 that Slovakia has. Now, I can't see why that would make why Ukraine would benefit from getting that, because they had S-300s and the Russians took them out. And of course, the Kinzhals can definitely take them out.
Brakanica says, can you please, in the context of this laptop discussion, connect the dots between Kolomoisky financially supporting the Azov battalion as well as being an owner of Burisma, where Hunter was on the board? So Biden connected through Kolomoisky to the NAZIs.
I don't think we needed to do very much connecting
you just connected
the dots. You connected them for us, yes.
You did it, yeah. You did it. I lay a lot of the blame on U.S. voters, 48% of them whom in 2020 voted for a demented crook for president who won, and 43% voted for a demented crook who lost.
Don't be too critical. Don't be too critical of Americans. I mean, they have to operate in a very difficult media environment.
It's a difficult, yeah. Zod the God said, "We'll know who is behind this is based on who is selected to replace Biden and Harris." Good point. If that
very
happens,
good point. Very, very, very good point.
This may be a naive question, but if the Speaker of the House is a Republican, do they become president if both Biden and Harris are impeached?
Yes. Is the short answer.
Yeah. If we impeach Harris, then we get Pelosi. Not good. True.
True, but of course, if the Republicans win the House, then of course it's no longer Pelosi as Speaker. It's a Republican.
And Real Otnosen says the Black Sea was a hub of ancient Greece seaside city colonies similar to the Mediterranean Sea, a very important region for the various Greek city-states.
Absolutely true. And by the way, the city of Athens in its heyday in the 5th and 4th centuries imported its food from the Black Sea. It was a very important part of the ancient economy.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's everything. One second. From Jeff. Step 1, the final one. Jeff says, Step 1, push Russia to snap and lash out. Step 2, crush the Russian economy. Step 3, place a Western-friendly regime in Russia. Step 4, China is surrounded on all sides with the entire Western world's resources backing up Taiwan, India, Japan, Russia, etc.
That's exactly the strategy. That was exactly the neocon strategy. It's not working so far. But you see, the risk is, well, first of all, one has to say so far. And of course, the risk is if it appears to be failing, the people who are authoring this strategy, as we said many times, they have no reverse gear. They will double down. They will do something even more dramatic, like blocking all Russian energy sales or something lunatic like that. And then, of course, it becomes a race about who cracks first, them or us.
All right, we will leave it there. Thank you, everybody. The Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY and the Duran.locals.com. Take care.